How much does grammar matter? Really matter when learning a foreign language? YouTube channel after YouTube channel makes the same claim that grammar doesn't really matter when you're learning a foreign language. It's better to learn a lot of vocabulary and preferably not through study, but through immersive context by engaging with interesting and meaningful content in your target language. I mean, heck, there's even one guy who posted like 100 times on one of my last videos about this. And I get it. The grammar translation method that newer approaches position themselves against isn't always that fun or interesting. It's kind of a grind. So when we hear that maybe there's more fun ways to go about learning that don't require the annoyance of dedicated grammar study, it's like, man, sign me up for that. So can we just dispense with grammar and get it intuitively with enough movies, TV, books, and fun in our target language? That's what I'm talking about today. If you don't know me, or you're new to the channel, I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and I love languages and language learning. And I'm here to rain on your parade. But like, in a fun way. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. I said your parade would be rained on, and I'll get back to that, but let's get on the same page. What's grammar? And why might people say you don't really need to study it? So grammar is not the boring spelling rules and orthographic conventions your teachers historically would have marked up in red ink on your papers. It's not being a gommenikker, if you'll pardon my Dutch. That's one of my favorite words, by the way. Leave me a comment if your language has an equivalent of someone who is so obsessed with nitpicking commas and colons that they might as well marry them. And no, nurker doesn't mean marry. Instead of that, when we're talking about language learning, it's what linguists call syntax. This is how the words and parts of words fit together and form bigger structures up to phrases and sentences. Ultimately, it's how one ordering of words, or multiple orderings of words with one set of case endings, if that's your jam, means something, and not something else. Yes, sometimes sentences are ambiguous, like the sentence, "It takes a village to raise a child." Does that mean an entire village is needed to raise any child, or that one specific annoying child needs the support of an entire freaking village? Is it a specific village and not a specific child? But even with those ambiguities, there's still only a narrow range of things that sentences can literally mean, and the word order, in English, matters. We'll get back to this. So grammar is things like word order, case marking, whether you use a resumptive pronoun in subordinate clauses, and so on. And more often than not, it's taught in an aggressively jargony and painfully boring way. To give a few examples, from random pages, from the beginnings of books I pulled off my shelf also at random, it's usually discussed like this. The vowels a and a are regularly reduced to schwa in open pro-pretonic syllables. The nonspecific state of the noun is formed by adding the indefinite enclitic and unstressed e to the noun. Because this ending is enclitic and therefore unstressed, the final syllable of the absolute state retains the stress. The nonspecific state indicates a certain or a particular thing or one of a class. The periphrastic conjugations also have infinitives formed by compounding the present or perfect infinitives of the verb sum with the future active and future passive participles. Bonus points to anyone in the comments who can tell me which 3 languages those are from books for. Let's be honest, reading that stuff and trying to learn how to actually use a language from descriptions such as those sucks. It just sucks. Even if you can decipher it, it's not exactly immediately helpful. And there's lots of evidence that many language learners simply can't decipher that Narishkeit. I'm not going to go too far into Krashen's theories of comprehensible input. The name is not a bad thing, but an underlying assumption that enough exposure to linguistic patterns is sufficient to learn, internalize, and be able to produce them is not well supported for adult learners. But that's precisely what the no grammar crowd advocates. The idea is that you don't need to sift through pages and pages of open pro-pretonic syllables to learn, and that instead enough exposure to the patterns of the language and actual use will make it intuitive. Sounds great. I used to be a part of this crowd. When I worked for Rosetta Stone, which definitely has its strengths, I fully drank the Kool-Aid. Maybe Joneses shouldn't make Kool-Aid jokes. Anyway, I was team immersion all the way. And while I made a lot of headway in some languages with that approach, I completely, thoroughly, miserably, abysmally failed to learn others with it. It turns out that a massive amount of exposure to correctly formulated Mandarin was woefully insufficient for me to piece together that subject position in a Mandarin sentence is understood as inherently definite, or when to use ra after a noun in Persian, or plenty of other things. The guy yelling at me in the comments most recently about how I'm advocating for the grammar translation method, that's not a thing and I'm not advocating for it, said that he and plenty of others are at C2 in English just from playing video games online or watching TV. He said I should ask the question, how we did that? Dude had a great and extensive vocabulary and argued a point fairly convincingly, but he also couldn't manage combining do support with question inversion in English. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we've established traditional textbook approaches to grammar are so boring that they make your teeth itch. But there's also the fact that drilling from a textbook and working with a teacher used to be the only way to do things. Then you get audio and language labs and things are suddenly easier, and we're now in an age where real-world materials aren't hard to come by. We can watch TV and movies and listen to podcasts in our target language with the click of a button. This did not used to be the case. And of course, it's easier to learn, on the whole, with those things. But what happened concurrently is that there was a massive wave of what I can only describe as copying Chomsky's main insight about language, but in inappropriate domains. Kids learn their first language with no guidance. In fact, guidance doesn't seem to do anything. But whatever language they're surrounded by, they'll eventually speak it like everyone else. This somehow got applied to literacy with disastrous results. If you haven't already, check out the podcast Sold a Story for more. The basic idea was that instead of teaching kids phonics, how letters and sounds work, we could just give them a lot of books and cozy reading nooks, and everything would take care of itself. But it turns out that reading is not hardwired. And this should be obvious, but neither is adult language learning. There are tremendous benefits to getting lots of engaging content in your target language, and you can generally make yourself understood even if you mess up the grammar a little bit. But ultimately, the grammar matters, like a lot. I've seen people say that you can get away with terrible grammar because people understand context. That's sometimes true. The example is often that you could go so far as to say, the man bit the dog, and people would infer that you actually meant things the other way around because your version is unlikely. The problem is, what if you want to say something unlikely? The entire principle upon which the no grammar crowd bases their approach is flawed in two ways. First, no amount of exposure to correct sentences is guaranteed to actually teach an adult learner. I can guarantee you that I would never have figured out the definiteness thing in Mandarin without explicit explanation. I confidently said thousands and thousands of sentences in Mandarin over at least a decade that totally violated that. And in general, yes, people did understand me just as I understood the no inversion of do support guy, but that's just the one case. Second, you can't actually say what you mean if you don't understand how to put words together. If I accidentally say the man bit the dog, you can probably piece together from context, if the man is bleeding and the dog is growling, both what actually happened and that I am an idiot. I would say, I'm very bad at the language we're speaking, but guess what the next step people jump to is? But more importantly, what if it's a man with Charles Manson eyes masticating a morsel of recently mutilated Malamute? What if I'm telling you that story and there's no context other than my ability to convey ideas to you in this language? The no grammar crowd basically assume that we are going to remove one of the key functions of language, displacement, the ability to talk about things that aren't currently happening in our immediate environment. So yeah, grammar matters. But the old school way of teaching it not only sucks, but requires knowing a bunch of jargon and assumes that you can diagram a sentence in your first language, which is so not the case for English speakers younger than me. Most of them can't actually read, it turns out. Again, Sold a Story. Check it out. By the way, leave me a comment if you diagrammed sentences in elementary school and how old you are. Doesn't have to be exact. We're not trying to dox anybody here, so, don't leave me your mother's maiden name or what you'd name that mangled Malamute or whatever. Okay, so what do we do then? Grammar matters, studying it sucks, and most of us lack the prerequisite knowledge to study it anyway. Well, the good news is that a lot of courses now actually take that into account, so you don't necessarily have to read traditional grammars. I do because I find them fun, but that's just me and a handful of linguists. There are dozens of us. In my video about how to make Bird app work, I pointed out that a lot of their lessons are intentionally teaching and forcing you to recall and use a specific grammatical concept. Most things are like this, including basically any of the sponsored content on my channel that I've endorsed. You can absolutely also just study the grammar. But the key thing to remember is that since it's an interlocking system, and even small children use all of it, it's both finite and learnable. I recently looked at a children's book in French for very young children, and it just had the subjunctive lying around like it was no big deal. Because it's actually no big deal. By the way, if you're confused by the subjunctive, I'll link my video about it at the end. Personally, I like to skim a grammar reference first and see what I'm working with, and then try to learn a language in context, periodically referring back to a grammar. But also, you could do that first pass on your language materials, looking at the grammar, and then really work through the materials, focusing on memorizing vocabulary and using all of the grammatical patterns that you learn. Without learning grammar, though, you won't be able to fully improvise. You'll be stuck at the level of a tourist with a phrase book or an intelligent bird. One's less annoying than the other, but they both kind of poop everywhere. I know, not all tourists, but if we're being fair, not all birds. So no, you don't have to be able to discuss grammar like an old-timey philologist, and frankly, that doesn't help you actually use it in your target language. But you do actually have to know how the words fit together to mean things, and how changing the order or case marking changes what they mean. And there's not a way to do that completely intuitively with no effort and no conscious learning, at least not that anybody has come up with yet. And definitely not as an adult. All right, so check out this video if you want to understand the subjunctive better than a child, or at least as well as a child. If you like what I'm doing here, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. It's great for the algorithm. And if you love what I'm doing here, you can always support the channel with super thanks right here on YouTube, or head over to patreon.com/languagejones and support the channel there. Until next time, happy learning.